Thank you all for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So welcome to the panel, Growing DEI from the Inside Out. We are thrilled to have you all join us today as we discuss the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the museum space, and what it takes to get a DEI initiative off the ground. We will ask, what does it take to jumpstart broad institutional change from the inside out? What are some of the hurdles we encounter when first integrating new modes of thinking and decision-making? How do we best sustain our initial efforts? How do crises like the COVID-19 pandemic and the killing of George Floyd shape our work? Today, we are speaking to you from Worcester County, Massachusetts, which is part of the unceded land of the Nipmuc Nation. We would like to acknowledge the Nipmuc community and pay our respects to their past, present, and future elders. So I am joined today by two fantastic panelists, Eliza Spaulding and Kane. Ali, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Olivia. I'm Allie. I use she, her pronouns. I am the grants manager at Tower Hill Botanic Garden. I have been at the garden for 3.5 years. I'm the staff co-chair of our Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility Committee, or our IDEA Committee, which works together to consider how Tower Hill can be an inclusive place to work, visit, and learn. I've also served on the American Public Garden Association's IDEA Committee, considering how gardens throughout the nation can be welcoming and accessible for all. Personally, all of my work is work towards my thesis, which is to assert the value of the unique role that cultural nonprofits play in the world of social justice. My fabulous co-presenter.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Eliza Spaulding. I have been the paper conservator at the Worcester Art Museum since 2014 and the chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee since 2019. As the paper conservator, I study and conserve a collection of over 23,000 prints, drawings, and photographs from around the world. And the mission of the DEI committee thus far has been to increase awareness of issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, support staff in their personal journeys, maintain alignment with the leadership team, and establish an open dialogue with our community. And I'll pass it back to you, Olivia.
Great, thank you, Eliza. Okay, I'm unmuted now. So I'm your panel moderator, Olivia Kiers. I also use she, her pronouns. I hold a master's in the history of art and architecture from Boston University and have been the curatorial assistant at the Worcester Art Museum since 2018. Prior to my role at WAM, I was the assistant editor of Art New England magazine, and my writing on contemporary art has appeared in the Boston Art Review, Big Red and Shiny, The Rib, Delicious Line, and others. At the Worcester Art Museum, I am a founding member of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. So we would like to begin this panel by sharing a bit of background on our institutions and our respective DEI and IDEA initiatives. I'll turn the mic over to Eliza to start us off with a brief PowerPoint.
Okay, thanks, Olivia. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, does that look okay? Yeah, okay, perfect. So for those who may be unfamiliar with Tower Hill Botanical Garden, located in Boylston, Massachusetts, and the Worcester Art Museum, located in Worcester, Massachusetts, we wanted to give you a sense of where they're located and share with you a little bit about them to provide some context to help frame our conversation today. So Worcester and Boylston, as you can see, are approximately 10 miles apart from each other and located just under 50 miles west of Boston. Worcester is the second largest city in New England with a population of about 185,000 people. And from the 2019 census, its population is approximately 69% white, 21% Hispanic or Latino, 13% Black or African American, 7% Asian, 0.5% American Indian, and about 4% two or more races. Of this, approximately 37,000 people, or 21% of the city's population, are immigrants from 85 different countries. The Worcester Art Museum currently has 68 full-time and 58 part-time staff, and Tower Hill currently has 49 full-time staff that can expand up to 100 during the spring and summer months. Both of our staff are predominantly white and female at the senior and mid-levels, with greater diversity of race and gender among our visitor services and maintenance staff. So now to share with you a little bit more about the Worcester Art Museum. It was founded in 1896 by Stephen Salisbury III and 50 members of the community, and opened its doors in 1898. It quickly began amassing a nearly encyclopedic collection that today hovers around 38,000 objects. It was established as a museum for the benefit of all, and our current mission is to connect people, communities, and cultures through the experience of art. One way we carry out our mission is through our partnerships with Open Door Arts to increase access, participation, and representation of people with disabilities in the arts, Clemente course to provide adults from disadvantaged backgrounds to take tuition-free studio arts classes for college credit, Head Start to provide early childhood education to at-risk youth, Arts Alternative to support at-risk youth under court protection, which allows them to exchange court hours for a gallery tour or studio arts class, and Genesis Club to provide support, training, education, and friendship to people living with mental illness. To give you a sense of our visitorship, from 2018 to 2019, we welcomed approximately 107,000 visitors from across New England, with our greatest concentrations coming from Worcester and Middlesex counties. And Middlesex County is the county just to the west of Boston. Our core audience has been white women 50 and older. So just to give you sort of a greater sense of the museum's collection, as I mentioned, it currently hovers around 38,000 objects and is nearly encyclopedic in scope, with strengths in old master paintings, American portraits and watercolors, Japanese prints, color prints, early photography, mosaics, and a recently acquired collection of arms and armor from the John Woodman Higgins Armory Collection, which was based in Worcester and closed in 2013. We currently have curators with expertise in European, American, Asian and Middle Eastern, prints, drawings and photographs, and arms and armor. Diversity of backgrounds, genders, abilities, and voices varies across the collection. Within the last 10 years, many of our curators have developed collecting strategies that strive to raise the visibility of underrepresented artists in the collection. And now I'll turn it over to Allie to share a little bit more about Tower Hill.
So Tower Hill is a 170-acre botanic garden in Boylston, Massachusetts. We are founded by the third oldest horticultural society in the country, opening in 1842 in downtown Worcester. And for the first century of our existence, we were reliant on the displays of gentlemen farmers and avid horticulturalists. However, as large estate gardens grew out of fashion, we moved to Tower Hill Botanic Garden in 1986 to open a public garden to increase public interest in horticulture and nature. The original farmhouse on our property dates back to the 1720s and serves as administrative offices. We have an education center, 2 conservatories, 16 formal gardens, and acres of conservation land. And we serve our mission to create experiences with plants that inspire people and improve the world. We see over 166,000 visitors annually, and while Boylston isn't particularly diverse, our visitors mainly come from Worcester County, which has a large diversity, as Eliza mentioned. However, confirmed by a recent survey, we do know that we cater towards an older demographic that is primarily white and female, but we are increasingly a place for young families. Recognizing that increasing technology and decreasing access to nature due to urban sprawl and gentrification, we really serve to be a place to connect people to nature in meaningful ways and exhibits that inspire, such as the Horticultural Heroes exhibit that was opened in 2019, which represented people of color and women from throughout history that have had an impact on horticulture, botany, and environmentalism. We also have run Free After 3 Thursdays, which is a summer program removing the financial barriers for people of all backgrounds and interests to visit the garden throughout the summer. The Garden Within Reach, which is showed on the top left and top right, opened in 2016 and is one of the first universally designed gardens in the state. We also serve to outreach to diverse groups, both bringing them to the garden and serving groups directly in the community. We have a partnership with Worcester Public Schools, particularly the second grade, which comes every year for an ecosystems exploration field trip. We have a partnership with the Worcester Refugee Assistance Youth Group. We've held the LGBT community, we've hosted the LGBTQ Community Pride Day last year, and we also work with the Worcester Tree Initiative to connect the community to the urban forest through training and community plantings.
Right. Thank you, Ali and Eliza, for that wonderful overview. So for today's discussion, I will be asking Ali and Eliza a series of questions that we hope you will all engage with as well as attendees. Just a reminder that you can do this by sharing your own experiences and questions in the chat and the session Q&A. So for our first question, let's start at the beginning. You were both involved in the formation of DEI and IDEA committees at your institutions. Could you describe briefly how these got their start? What were some of the factors that contributed to the inception of your committee or policy? And Eliza, I'm going to put you on the spot to get us started.
That sounds great. So our DEI committee really sort of took formation at the museum last summer in August. And it started really when our director of human resources at the time, and now our COO, organized a DEI training with a woman named Valerie Zalesi Wyndham of Promoting Good in Central Massachusetts. And the training was, it took place over 3 days. And the first day was working with the leadership team. The second day was working with sort of a small group of 10 staff members. And the third day, that group of 10 staff members worked with Valerie to co-lead a larger training for a greater number of staff members. And so that's really how the conversation took place in sort of a very focused way. And after the conversation, that group of 10 staff members sort of debriefed on the experience. And, you know, we of course all realized that this wasn't a conversation that takes place in isolation. It was a part of a much greater conversation that needed to continue. So with the support of the leadership team, we then formed the DEI committee. But what I think is important to recognize is how these efforts don't take place in a vacuum. So I think what has been really interesting, and I think we sort of really only learned this after the fact, is that, and we knew some of this sort of from being on staff, but conversations about DEI had always sort of been taking place in sort of different parts of the museum. It was never sort of a united focus conversation, but it was always part of the conversation. And in fact, later we learned that the museum had a diversity committee at one point in its history. So I think there was sort of a lot of groundwork that had been laid that really helped support the success of the committee's formation. And what I feel, and Olivia, please weigh in too, as a fellow member of the committee, fortunate about is that from the very beginning, we had very good alignment. The board, the leadership team, staff all recognized the importance of this work. So that, I think, really sort of helped us form a very good foundation. And during that first year, I think we're just coming up on sort of our 1-year anniversary. During that first year, for us, it was really all about figuring out who we wanted to be as a committee. What did we want our work to be about? What kind of impact did we want to make? How were we going to sort of go about achieving that impact? So a lot of the first year we spent kind of laying that groundwork and really sort of trying to infiltrate the staff because, as I sort of mentioned, this wasn't, it was part of, certain conversations, but it wasn't part of a united conversation across the museum. So I think we spent a lot of time that first year trying to make it one through sort of just utilizing all of the museum's communication channels. So sort of speaking regularly at staff meetings, sharing articles with staff over email, just making that information sort of widely accessible in a range of forms. So that has been part of what has brought us to the present moment. But I'm curious to hear, Allie, how sort of things got started at Tower Hill.
Absolutely. So I always like to say that we started off as a whole bunch of diversity inclusion rebels. There were several of us who are really passionate about making the change that we were able to in our own sphere of influence. So for example, our education coordinator at the time had previously worked at an institution that had worked with the refugee community. So she reached out to the Worcester Refugee Assistance Project and said, hey, we would love to work with you. What kinds of programs and services could Tower Hill provide for you? And they co-created a program for the youth group. I started throwing my pronouns in my signature, and very quickly everybody else caught on to what I was doing and started throwing their pronouns in their signature. I had seen that there was interest in marching in Worcester Pride. So I said, hey, I'd love to march. I'd love to have a table at the festival. And immediately the CFOO said, yes, and can we have a flag? And we did a pride flag raising. This past year would have been our 4th flag raising. But what was happening is, because it was all of these little rebels doing whatever they could within their own sphere of influence, we really needed something more thoughtful. And there were a lot of gaps in understanding about how all of these programs work together and actually tracking progress. So in February 2019, our CEO got back from the American Public Garden Association board meeting and a cohort of directors of large gardens. And she said, I was her executive assistant at the time. And she said, Allie, I'm done with this. We need a committee. I am committed to diversity, equity, inclusion. We need to think about this thoughtfully, and we need a committee to come around these issues and coordinate all of our efforts. So it actually began as a joint committee of the board and staff. There were a lot of members of the board who were committed to diversity and equity and inclusion. Some of them were sitting around saying, I don't know how to even begin. Other people started to have some ideas, and we really wanted this to be seen as a priority of the organization and for there to be accountability. So myself, Kirsten Swartz, who was the education coordinator at the time, and Liz Miska, who was on the board, we came together as our triumvirate of co-chairs. We were all passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And Kirsten and I, because of our roles in the institution at the time, we had the ability as well as the expertise and the time in order to lead these efforts. So we opened it up that anybody could apply to be part of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. And then it was that cohort was selected by myself, the CEO, and my 2 fabulous co-chairs. We hosted meetings every other month, and we tried to begin with things that we knew would be impactful, but things that we could easily do. So we started off with staff trainings. We did a staff survey last December, and I'm getting ready to do one now this year. And we also had a brown bag lunch discussion group. While there were a lot of people who were committed to learning about diversity, equity, and inclusion, they may not have had the time or the interest to serve on a committee. So we had monthly brown bag lunches for a while to get some discussion groups going, talking about everything from age in the workplace to the intersection of identity and agriculture. I think the biggest factors of success in those early years, in those early months, was that we had staff interest and staff expertise to provide, and that we had CEO buy-in. That it was the CEO who was bringing us all together, who was supported by a very enthusiastic board president to make this be a priority.
Olivia, do I have time to pick up on a couple of those points?
Absolutely, please do, Eliza.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to hear sort of more about your experience, Allie, and to pick up on some of the similarities in our journeys thus far. And some of those that I saw were, you know, having staff investment, having investment at the leadership level. And then in terms of how our committees have started to sort of work across our organizations, providing sort of a diverse range of ways that people can participate is really critical. And I think if folks who are here with us today are considering sort of the possibility of starting their own DEI initiatives at their institution, which can take many different forms, I think it's really interesting to sort of be able to take the temperature of your organization as a place to start. You know, are folks in your organization sort of already open to this discussion, or does that need to be part of the work of starting a process?
No, thank you, Eliza. Yeah, those open lines of communication, I think, are very important. Kind of to that end, what are some of the hurdles that you encountered when rolling out that first initiative?
So I see that we actually just had this question in the chat. Thank you, Kathy. So I think the biggest challenge in launching a joint board and staff initiative is that there really difference is in priorities. While it is really important for there to be thoughtful buy-in from, you know, from the bottom to the top and having those joined together, the board is thinking about how to make its own makeup diverse. Whereas the staff surely is talking about how to make the staff diverse, but there's a little bit more of a natural turnover in a board, whereas staff, it's, well, what positions are available or created, which doesn't necessarily happen as regularly. Also, the staff are dealing with these issues on a day-to-day basis. We're also seeing each other every day. So we move at a quicker pace, which as a board committee is a little bit more long-term and a little bit more thoughtful and methodical. So we actually decided to divide the two committees this spring. So we had about a year of trying it out, and we definitely learned a lot, but we really thought that it was important to divide them. Also, as the executive assistant, I was used to having FaceTime with all of the trustees. However, some of the junior staff on the board or on the committee, they were not used to. And so there was a little bit of a power dynamic that wasn't always productive to having a collaborative experience. I think we do hope that over the coming years, we have a couple committee meetings where we do intersect them every once in a while. And so I ultimately think that this is going to be a really great way in order to make sure that the board is seeking diverse board members, leading strategically, being a catalyst in the community, and for the staff to focus on the day-to-day operations and staff internally, as well as how we serve our visitors externally. Eliza, what have you experienced in terms of challenges in this past year?
Yeah, I think sort of one of the very first challenges that we experienced was integrating this work into our workload. I think at the beginning there is, it felt, even though it's of course part of all of our work, it felt new. And I think by nature, this work requires one to be extremely thoughtful and sort of carving out that time to be really thoughtful and strategic and impactful felt hard at first. And I think we also were sort of very aware of what that was referred to in the keynote earlier this morning, is that, a lot of, all of issues sort of that are related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, a lot of them lead back to, deeply rooted systemic problems that that have already and will continue to take a very long time to really make change in. So from the beginning, we were very aware that we had to be very thoughtful, very measured in our pace, so that we would be setting something up that could be sustained. That was, I think we really had an awareness of that from the beginning, not to try to take sort of everything on at once, because I think, it's very easy to get kind of very impassioned about wanting to work on a lot of these issues. So I think we were sort of well positioned in having that understanding from the beginning, but still sort of trying to figure out how to carve out the time in a measured way. And I think very specifically that sort of came to the fore for us, as I mentioned sort of in some of my introductory remarks. We also recognized as a staff-led committee how important it was that we had alignment with the board and the leadership team. And during that first year as the chair of the committee, as I sort of mentioned, so much was about sort of finding our footing. And we always had regular monthly meetings with our director of human resources, and she sits at the leadership table. But we, or I specifically, I wasn't able to sort of figure out how to manage that in my schedule, how to be part of leadership team meetings on sort of a regular basis. But this year, now that we have some of that structure in place, I've started to do that. And so that feels like a really nice step towards sort of greater alignment, because I think we all realize how this has to be worked at sort of from every corner of an organization. It can't just live within a staff committee. So those were some of the sort of, early challenges and challenges we're still kind of working through. And another I wanted to mention that's only come up really a few times, but I think it's significant, which is, we've sort of over the course of a year made it a practice of being a regular presence at our all staff meetings. And last year, I remember someone commenting and sort of questioning, why is this work important? Why should our organization be doing this? And I thought that was really meaningful to hear at that point, actually. Everyone has a very different journey with this work. I think some people, some folks really want to sort of understand how this is very sort of directly impacting their work. And I think that question, really gets to some of the internal struggles that our organization and other organizations can face when doing this work, is how to sort of allow folks to see sort of the very concrete steps that one can take that make impact, and also some of the things that are a little bit harder to see, like how you are changing your organization's culture, and what that means, and how that actually is sort of, one of the most incredibly impactful parts of this work. And I think at the time that question also really spoke to how we didn't quite have that organizational alignment sort of as greatly as we needed to. At that point, I think folks were really hearing about DEI sort of purely from the committee perspective, and not sort of enough from the leadership perspective as well. And that's something we've been able to, sort of slowly change over the past few months.
Thank you, Eliza and Ali. I just wanted to sort of jump in here because I saw something in the Q&A that I think really does dovetail to what you're both saying. So earlier today in the keynote, which was shared by Jamal Jimerson, the founder of the Minority Inclusion Project. So he was talking a bit about how diversity is not a solution. Diversity itself is not the end goal because there are these deeper systemic challenges that we face. Good optics are great, but that really only helps you from a PR standpoint. And so some of this work that we're doing that does involve shifting sort of institutional culture or really examining ourselves, that takes time. And sometimes there is a hurdle where people don't quite immediately understand that the work is important, quite frankly. If you say like, oh, but, they'll throw out a number like 25% of the people who visit us are X minority. And that's really not the point. So I just wanted to say thank you for bringing that up in the Q&A. That is a really important point to make when we're talking about hurdles. How do we achieve diversity but continue moving on towards equity and inclusion and accessibility? So I want to move on to our next question. Museums, like many other nonprofits, often operate with limited resources, whether those are budgetary or due to a small staff size, any number of limitations. Is it possible to do effective DEAI work with limited resources? Are resources out there that are available for free? And if significant resources do need to be allocated to an initiative to get it off the ground, what might be some effective ways of advocating for the allocation of those resources or securing funding from outside sources? Now, I'm going to throw this to Ali first because she is the grants manager at Tower Hill, so I feel like she has some special insight here.
Absolutely. So in terms of personal or professional resources, I think it's important to think about the resources that you already have on staff and what you could realistically do with $0. So for me, I have hosted LGBTQ ally training in the past. So that was something that I knew that I could put together very quickly and host and would be comfortable hosting for my colleagues. My co-chair, Kirsten, had done a lot of work in the accessibility space and was able to do the same. And our trustee, Liz, is actually a visually impaired person and has done a lot of training, literally where she will blindfold members of the staff in order to have an immersive experience. So those were 3 things that off the bat we were able to do to volunteer our time and services. And then once you get that sort of foundation of what you could do based on the expertise you have, is think about scaling up and what you could do with a little bit more professional development and a little bit more money. I also think it's important to look at what your peers are doing. And as a grant manager, I know that funders do not like to spend money frivolously, and they like when organizations work together. So thinking about the Worcester Art Museum and Tower Hill Botanic Garden, we have a few very generous funders who love us both dearly. There is no favorite child, but they're not going to want to spend X amount of money for Worcester Art Museum to have racial equity training and Tower Hill to do racial equity training. If they're reading all of those applications back to back, they're going to think, well, they're kind of doing the same thing. That's great. But wouldn't it be better if we said, well, we're going to spend, instead of double your money, we're going to spend 1 or 1.5 times your money, and we're going to come together and do a joint racial equity training because we work with a similar community. We know our visitors are similar and we know that our staffs are similar. It's also a great way to share together. If money isn't something that, any sort of grant funding or donor sponsored training isn't something that you have the capacity to apply for or seek at the moment, also look at what your peers are doing. So I'm nervous to say this in front of 93 other museum professionals, but I just told you all that I can do a really great LGBTQ ally training. Maybe there's somebody on your staff who could do a really great age equity training, which is something we're searching for. maybe there's something that we can do to trade together, or I can share those LGBTQ ally training materials and there's someone on your staff who we could do a train the trainer sort of thing. Also look at universities. We are so lucky to be in New England, even though, Worcester and Boston, I know, are saturated with universities, but all throughout New England, we were really, really lucky. And think about what kinds of organizational resources they have. Look at their diversity inclusion website. Yeah, it's going to be catering towards a student population, but is there something that they were sponsoring that you could see if you could send somebody to for free, or you can repurpose for you, or somebody you could have an informational interview with. Also, don't underestimate the value of personal growth. Read as much as you can, because similar to what the keynote was saying today, like, this needs to be authentic work. So right now on my nightstand table, I have Me and White Supremacy by Layla Saad, which is kind of an internal workbook reflecting on personally how white supremacy has been at play in my life and my interactions with it. I will also give you the hot tip from the Grants and Corporate Foundation Relations. Grants and corporations are hyper-focused on racial equity in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others. So work with your advancement staff. There are so many foundations and individuals interested in doing this work, and it's something that's new and meaningful and exciting that your museum is doing. On that note, there are some donors who are going to leave because they don't agree with the rainbow flags or the Black Lives Matter movement. But remember that there are a lot of people who do agree with it and may come forward more loudly and more generously as you share that work. I attended a great session that was talking about the Emerson Theater, and there was a gentleman who really pushed to have a lot more racial equity programming at that theater. And a large donor completely said, I'm not for this, I'm gone. And this was $1 million donor. And they said, cool, see you later. And somebody else came forward and said, this is really important for me. I've been waiting to support somebody who is getting racial equity in the arts, and ended up being that $1 million donor. So I think that it's really important to work with your advancement staff and have them understand that. And there are so many things that all of our museums go for. For being a botanic garden, climate change is another thing. Some people don't want to acknowledge that climate change is real. We're going to lose donors and members once we start doing that programming, but think about all of the other members and donors who are going to be interested because we are offering that programming. So I think it's really important. We're in a really important and crucial time right now that for these now 95 people who are on this call, there are so many grant funding opportunities out there, and you have 95 colleagues who are committed to this. Let's work on making small cohorts. Let's get training, let's share resources. And I really think that no matter how large or small your organization is, there are free resources within your institution, within the larger museum community, and then there are grant funders who are vastly and incredibly enthusiastic about supporting this work. Eliza, while we're certainly twins in in the Worcester family, what have you learned in terms of pushing forward this work with limited resources at the Art Museum?
Well, first, I just want to say, Ali, I really appreciate how sort of expansively and collaboratively you look at this work. I think that is, I think that really opens up a lot of opportunities, and is also, clearly what really this work is all about. So I really appreciate that. So yes, like you, I also think about resources very much in terms of sort of staff resources, people resources, and financial resources. And in terms of staff resources, as we've kind of touched upon at different points, for us, what has been really critical is establishing a framework to do this work that is sustainable. So, we've sort of set up a structure of a committee, and that may not be sort of the right makeup for everyone, but it's the one we're sort of currently experimenting with. So we're a committee of about 10 staff members. with a chair. And every year we, folks have the opportunity if they'd like to stay on or rotate off. And we haven't rotated sort of the chair position yet. I think that if we continue with that model, I think that will sort of speak to our sustainability a little further, because that will sort of speak to if we've built something that can continue to sustain. So I think finding the right model that is sustainable is huge. And in terms of available resources, I love the idea of sort of looking locally and seeing what's available. What are the collaborative opportunities? I think we are really fortunate that we are living in a time where there are a lot of available free resources to us. For example, and one that we've sort of shared in our resource document is the nonprofit organization of By For All, which is an organization that works with other nonprofit organizations to increase inclusion. And they have a lot of really incredible free toolkits on their website. And they're not the only organization out there like that. There are so many that if you have the staff time, I don't want to sort of let that slip by because that's huge. But there are a lot of resources like that out there that are, sort of freely available. I think where finances really come into play is in sort of thinking about scaling one's effort and pace. So for us, for example, we started this, the DEI committee last year. We've been sort of very internally focused, I would say, very sort of focused on staff development. And just this year, just this past summer, sort of a smaller group of committee members worked together to form a DEI plan for the museum that describes steps that we can take as an organization for the next 3 years. And as part of that plan, there are sort of some more concrete financial commitments. So we are sort of right at a sort of tender moment where we'll see as an organization how many of those financial commitments we're able to absorb at this time. But I think I would imagine that every organization reaches a point where financial commitment will become part of the conversation. And if this is an institutional priority, it's something that it has to be made a financial priority. So we're sort of right at the beginning of that journey. And I think where we have sort of positioned ourselves well, I hope, to have that conversation is that we have been talking about this as a staff for a while now. So it's not a new conversation. And we are sort of well ahead of next year's budgeting process. So sort of the key for a lot of initiatives at the museum is to have those conversations early on, well in advance of an annual budgeting process, so that there's sort of an awareness of them. So when the time comes, it's not a surprise, and folks have kind of already been thinking about it.
Thank you, Eliza and Ali. As we continue to talk a bit more about sustaining some of these initial efforts, I'd like to offer the following food for thought. This comes from Andrea Montiel de Schumann, who is the former digital experience designer at the Detroit Institute of Art, whose public letter of resignation this past June kind of made waves in the arts world. And when people talk about, museums and diversity and the issues we face, it's something that is sometimes brought up. So in an ArtNet article from September, she is quoted as saying, "Diversity means nothing when there are no equitable practices and intentional acknowledgements of what actually happens in decision-making." So with decision-making and organizational hierarchies in mind, ideally, who should be involved on a DEI committee? And in your organization, who does the DEI committee or DEI spokesperson answer to? And I am going to toss this to Allie first.
So I think everybody should be on your diversity, equity, and inclusion committee. I think that there are a few key people that we've been bouncing around today. Definitely human resources, because we're going to be talking about internal affairs, and so it's really important to have whoever represents HR there. It's also important to have education and collections on your committee, because they need to understand the importance of telling diverse stories through your collections. Any sort of front-facing staff, so this is visitor operations, gift shop, maintenance, in our case, it's horticulture. These are people who are engaging with diverse visitors every single day. And so they understand the kinds of questions that come up, they understand the kinds of complaints and compliments, and they also see who's coming in and what the needs are of those individuals. As I mentioned, it's really important to also have your advancement staff bought in one way or another, because there are a lot of grant opportunities. And if you have a membership program, it's also affecting your members. And it's also really important to respect and value the insight and knowledge of all staff members. So I think we know that there are people, unfortunately, within our organization who are not always valued based on the roles that they have. And this is a really great opportunity to give those people a voice, to give junior staff members an opportunity for a bit of professional development, or just to give some of our other staff members have a really critical voice in the institution. Ultimately, I think that it makes sense for your diversity inclusion committee to either report to HR or to the CEO. Because this is so strategically important, it needs to have accountability to the top. So in Tower Hill's case, myself and my Kirsten left us, and now Gitu Jane, who's our creative marketing manager, she's my co-chair, and so her and I report to our CEO. We're working on that reporting structure. We'll probably look at something like a meeting every 6 weeks in order to just talk about what's going on. But if it's just strategically important, you need somebody higher up. Eliza, I know you mentioned that your COO is really involved, but who do you think should be on these kinds of committees as people are getting going?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said. I think it's in sort of composing our staff committee, we have tried to be diverse in terms of its representation, in terms of being able to sort of reach across the museum, and then also in terms of the types of folks who are actually serving on the committee, to have it be a diverse makeup of people. So we've sort of tried to balance both of those, also with staff sort of interest. This work, as we've talked about in a few different contexts today, it's effortful. And so having folks who are ready to sort of dig into that work on a personal and organizational level. So that has been sort of a little bit about the makeup of our committee. And then in terms of who, a committee like this should report to, I agree. I mean, I think we don't sort of know any other structure yet. We've always reported to first our Director of Human Resources and now our COO, but I think that that has always felt like the right fit. I mean, human resources, right, by nature, it's all about the people who work there, the culture of the organization, and that's so much of what this work is about. So I think that sort of direct reporting has been, has made a lot of sense for us. But I also think, sort of really being in very close alignment with the leadership team, the folks who are sort of making decisions and setting the tone, is huge. So that is, as I mentioned, a step that we've been really happy to sort of been able to take over the past few months.
Thank you. So My next question, I'm going to play devil's advocate just a little bit. So how do you achieve balance between doing both the hard work of public-facing museum programming, which has the power to offer inclusion and accessibility to diverse audiences, as well as behind-the-scenes initiatives such as addressing workplace culture, professional development, or guiding decision-making? Does one take precedence over the other?
I can start off with this one. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think that the two are so interrelated. And I think they're so interrelated, and both impact each other so much, right? And I think about our own sort of journey at Worcester. And as I sort of mentioned, there had been a lot of conversations around DEI before the committee even started. But they were sort of taking place in from my perspective, in sort of very discrete ways, in terms of sort of discrete projects or certain community partnerships, and not really in a holistic way. But that sort of fed into the interest and acceptance in our committee. And then we've been able to start to work together as a staff. And we have worked in sort of a very, as I keep saying, like a very internal staff-led way at the beginning. But what's been an interesting product of that is that now we are working on a DEAI plan, and that will start to have some sort of more sort of outward facing components. And also, again, sort of that less tangible part. We as a staff are talking about all of these issues way more than we ever were. It's on everyone's mind sort of all the time now. So the lens through which everyone is looking at things is slowly starting to change. I hope that's just not my perspective. So I think the two, it's so cyclical. They really feed into each other. And I think what's interesting is, and I know we'll get to this a little bit more later, but I think what is at the heart of a lot of this work is transparency. And I think if one is sort of producing projects that don't start to speak to what that organization is all about, folks can, I don't know if they can see it, but like it's there and it's real. So I think we're aware of that we want, all of the sort of programs that we are organizing and supporting to be reflective of the organization that we are trying to become. And Allie, I'm curious to hear some of your thoughts.
No, I absolutely agree. To your last point, this is why it's really important to figure out what the greatest need of your organization is. What needs to happen in terms of internally or externally in order for the other to succeed. So if you have staff who internally are unhappy and feel discriminated against, they're going to see right through your outward facing Black Lives Matter statement. And that is going to trickle through your organization, and worst case scenario, trickle into public relations. And so it's just important to really figure out what's authentic for your organization. Also, how can you have the greatest impact? So a staff-facing initiative, in Tower Hill's case, it could affect 50 to 100 people, and outward-facing, it could be, 160,000 people. But are you having a massive impact on those 50 to 100 people and just a little bit of an impact on those visitors? So you really need to think about what makes sense authentically for your organization. And also, what are people responding to, both visitors and staff? So for us, Education for our staff has been resoundingly something that people need. And people are seeing how they can take ownership of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility within their specific realm. So for us, we really see that as something that we can have a really great impact. And that is by default going to start affecting our visitors. So if our visitor services staff is really committed to hiring diverse staff members, then when people walk through the doors, they're seeing somebody who perhaps looks like them. Or when they're thinking about how to do signage or reconfigure, especially in this day and age, we have a lot of one-way routes through areas, making sure it's accessible. That's going to help the person who comes through with a wheelchair or a stroller or is visually impaired. And I think it's always important to find a balance. So while yes, it's important to find the things that are sort of those low-hanging fruit and where you can make a deep impact, find a balance between things that are public facing and internal facing, but then also find a balance between things that are easy and the things that are challenging for your organization. I think it's impossible for one to take precedence over the other. You really need to find that balance in order for it to feel authentic for your staff members and for your community.
Yeah, I think that having that integration at all levels where you're doing the public facing programs, but you're also listening to staff needs and concerns and thinking about that in a very forward thinking way, that is so important, Ali, and you're correct. Like if one is missing, staff and visitors are going to see right through that, right? And Eliza, to your point about transparency, I think that it is important to note that, and thinking about the keynote we heard earlier today as well, museums are kind of part of this system of white privilege. And there are ways that museums sort of systematically have failed people. And I think that being transparent about where one may have failed your visitors, but also your staff in the past, and then moving ahead and like taking that as a learning opportunity and an opportunity for growth is very important. And that acknowledgement goes a long way. And so to that point, I have a quote here from Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. He writes, "The only way to undo racism is to constantly identify it and describe it, and then dismantle it. Furthermore, racist and anti-racist are not fixed identities. We can be racist one minute and an anti-racist the next." So while this quote addresses one specific topic within the DEAI field, namely racism, right, it raises a point that reflects on our work as a whole. So diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives can cover a wide range of issues, and there's a seemingly endless amount of work to be done to achieve equity and inclusion in our society. How do we set goals? How do you measure success? How do you keep from being overwhelmed at the magnitude of certain issues such as racism, sexism, income disparity? I mean, I could go on. Eliza, do you want to take this on first?
Sure. I really appreciate that question. I think for a lot of folks, and I include myself to a certain degree, a lot of the issues that touch upon DEAI are systemic and they are overwhelming. But it is within every organization's capacity, I believe, to take them on. And it's, as we've sort of touched upon at various points, this is, it's a journey. And taking sort of small steps along the way, while they can feel small, they can be impactful ones. So to that end, I think goal setting is really important. It's important because it gives the work focus, and it's also important to really talk about as a staff, because such a big part of this work, especially in the organization that we both have, is bringing people along with you and not just making it your work, making it sort of the organization's work. So one thing that we have tried to do, and I think there's probably some room for improvement here, is to goal set together as a staff, and to talk about the process, to talk about the ways that we're thinking about things, the ways that they might be, and then come together around a set of goals. So, you know, sort of during our first year, the goal setting was very sort of internally focused within our committee, and we were really focused on staff education, and we sort of set goals around that by saying we were going to lead sort of a certain number of roundtable discussions a year. We were going to be sharing articles on a monthly basis. We were going to be a regular presence at all staff meetings. So those were sort of very concrete ways that we were doing goal setting. And now we're sort of moving into more sort of strategic ways of goal setting in our DEAI plan, and how we can work together with staff members across the organization to more fully empower them in their work, and how each of their roles is all going to be playing into something much, much greater. So that is sort of some of the ways that we have started to think about goal setting. And in terms of measuring success, I think a really important part of this work is always having an evaluation piece. So with all of the sort of internal initiatives that the committee has focused on, the roundtable discussions, articles, recently we started doing lunchtime gatherings. We've always had an evaluation sort of attached to those so that we can gain feedback and understand, you know, what we're putting out there, how is it being received? Are we sort of on the same page? Are there ways in which we're missing the mark that we might need to make some adjustments? So that has been really critical for us. And I think also promotes, again, what this work is about, that it's about all of us working together. So that has been really important to us, doing that sort of evaluation piece. And I think once we actually sort of start to embark on our DEAI plan, I think and even just continuing this work in general, I think we have to be very mindful that setting goals, achieving goals is certainly part of this work, but how we get there is just as, if not more important. So we want to be very careful and of our journey, that it is extremely thoughtful, because as we know, this work can also do harm, that it's extremely thoughtful, and that we are sort of shifting the culture as we sort of move toward these goals, some of which are very sort of outward facing. So those are sort of some of my thoughts about how we can sort of goal set and be sort of mindful of our process and how we're achieving it. But Allie, I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are.
Absolutely. So admittedly, this is something that Tower Hill needs to be better at. And when I hear Eliza and Olivia talk about, I always get a little bit embarrassed. But I think that's something to honor. For us, it's one of the reasons why there are so many staff on this committee, so that we're always kind of holding each other accountable. For us, it's really about identifying what affects our organization. So we're mainly female. We are very white. Our staff survey said that age discrimination was an issue that a lot of people were feeling about. So if we get a whole bunch of BIPOC people, they still have ages, and so they're still going to feel age discrimination. So that's something that people right now are dealing with. So maybe that's something that we should really thoughtfully consider, is what does age discrimination look like at Tower Hill? Unpack it. How can we solve that issue? And also be looking at racial equity of our staff. We continue to measure our inclusion, sort of the feeling of inclusion with our staff survey. We're increasing frequency because while we had a staff survey last December, I don't have any further data. And so that's why we're going to be doing it again this December, but we're hoping also to do it next June. We have, under normal circumstances, we have a lot of holiday staff, and then we have lots of summer staff. So we're actually missing a huge portion of people by only hosting it in December. So we get more data and we get more people. I think it's also important to list out what you've achieved. That is one way of measuring your success. Everything to an admission program, to an outreach program, to launching a staff survey, or simply having a simply having an idea committee. I think it's really important to see all of that on one sheet of paper, because I think we can get overwhelmed with how complex these issues are and think we're making no progress, and recognize that we actually are making some progress. And I think, yes, we don't want to pat ourselves on our back and say we've done it, this is over, but it is really good to see the progress that you have made within the past 6 months, year, 5 years. And I think it is I think the way that this work is done is through a bunch of little steps in a few giant leaps. Me throwing my pronouns in my signature, that's a tiny step. Hosting Pride Day is a giant leap. I think that there are these ways that we need to honor that it is a whole bunch of little things. The same way that a microaggression builds up within over a day or over a week, and then that's why you feel discriminated against. The same way that all of these little fixes, if they're the opposite of microaggressions, they all build up and you say, wow, being at this museum feels a lot different than it did a year ago. I can't put my finger on it. And that's because it's about, 10 little things that a visitor or a staff member isn't necessarily recognizing. And I think Eliza has done a great job of outlining the importance of setting annual goals. And that's something that, while the idea committee at Tower Hill is, a little shy of 2 years old, something we haven't done. And that's something that as we're looking towards 2021, we want to set our annual goals based on the staff survey and feedback, and also the pulse of the community at large.
Yeah, thank you, Ali. You bring up something really important that I just want to reiterate. Both of our committees are young. So at Tower Hill, 2 years, the Worcester Art Museum, 1 year. But before we kind of were a formal committee, we were doing some little things. And so sometimes what it takes to bring all those little things together is to be a little more vocal about it as a staff member, to bring together staff and to set goals and to address something in a more systematic way. And then you start seeing those little things really make an impact as a concerted effort. So I want to be mindful of time, but we have a ton of fantastic questions I've been seeing coming in with the Q&A, but I did just want to ask one last question before we move to that Q&A, because in our panel description, we mention 2020, right? The year we are blessed to be living in. So 2020 has been a year of reckoning for many museums and cultural institutions across the nation, from COVID-19 related shutdowns, layoffs, realigned goals, to the heightened discourse surrounding race relations in the US. So what were some of the greatest impacts, whether they're positive or negative, that these events have had to DEI work at your institution this year? And Eliza, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I think it's hard to really capture what this year has been about, right? We're still in it, and I think, obviously a lot of the events of the COVID-19, the killings of George Floyd and other Black Americans, they brought to the fore inequities in our society that we always knew were there. That wasn't a surprise, but they just brought them sort of much closer to folks in a way that, not that I think everyone perceives these things differently. If one had been, sort of not as mindful of them, it was very hard not to be mindful of them. Again, I feel like I'm still wrestling with how to really describe what this year has meant. And we may not really be able to until some time. But I think this year has sort of struck a human chord, an emotional chord for many folks. And certainly for us at the Worcester Art Museum, these events have been really meaningful. And after the killing of George Floyd and other Black Americans, our institution shared a statement, which is something that's been interesting to see, right? A lot of museums, nonprofit organizations sort of did something very similar. And what does that mean for an organization to make a statement like that? And then internally, we had an all-staff meeting where we sort of, the only goal of the meeting was to spend some time sort of processing those events together as a staff, which is hard to do under normal circumstances, and perhaps even a little harder to do over Zoom, where everything feels slightly stilted. So those are some of the sort of very direct ways that we have been sort of processing this year together. And out of those conversations really came that idea that in spite of past efforts that touched upon DEAI, and in spite of the formation of this committee, which was starting to give our organization more focus, we still did not yet have a plan where everyone sort of had a defined role and how we could work together towards this more unified vision. And so that's really what came out of this year for us, was doing the work of forming a DEAI plan. And what has been really wonderful about that process for us is that over the course of 4 months, we didn't really start working on that until August. So a few months after some of these events started. And what we sort of did was we spent 4 months as part of this sort of little ad hoc committee to work on the plan. As Olivia knows, as a fellow ad hoc committee member, speaking with staff across the museum. But what is sort of built into that process is that we were sort of taking a moment in our own way, even though we were all still working, to pause and to be thoughtful about our work and to reflect. And I think that that kind of work does happen more on the leadership level, but as a staff, I don't know if it does as much if we really take that time to just reflect, to deeply reflect on our past practices and work, and really think about how we want that to inform our next steps. I think things can be so busy and we get so caught up in sort of moving on to what's next. Just because that's just how things go. Sometimes the rhythm is just very fast. So that the process of being able to stop and reflect and be thoughtful has just been, I hope, has been so huge for us as an organization, and I hope will become sort of part of the regular pattern of how we move forward, that we do that more together as a staff and allow that to inform our future initiatives and actions. So that's a little bit about how it's impacted us. Allie, what has the experience been like for you?
Absolutely. And I love to hear Eliza talk about that staff trust building, because I think that's ultimately what makes it so important. I personally pride myself on being somebody who leads the idea committee with an idea of having compassionate curiosity. So I'm trying to be always accessible. So I tried to model that for our other staff members. I've had a trustee who felt comfortable coming to me and he said, Allie, why is it important for me to put my pronouns in my signature? And he knew that I wasn't going to say, well, you should just do it. And I had just an honest conversation. I said, you and I walk through the world and have the privilege of our gender identities matching what people perceive us as. Not everybody else has that. And so by putting your pronouns in your signature, you're saying, I'm not going to assume anything about your gender. And and therefore I am telling you mine, and it's an invitation for you to tell me yours. And he understood it. And we were able to just have that dialogue. And so I think building that community of trust. And I think the reality of it is there are going to be some, just as I was mentioning before, there are going to be donors and members who decide no longer to be part of your institution. There are unfortunately going to be staff members who also no longer want to be part of your institution. And that's part of institutional change. But I think we all know this, is that the people who are applying, regardless of what they're applying for, is they have an investment in the mission of our organizations. And they probably weren't going to apply for that job if they didn't believe in it. I know there's a lot of necessity of work, but you at least probably have, 5% investment, hopefully, in the mission of the organization. Otherwise, you would have found a job, a job elsewhere. In terms of how 2020 has affected us, we needed to take a pause. The reality of it is that we needed to focus on fundraising, and as the primary grant writer, a lot of that burden came on me and my colleagues. Our programming staff had to think about how to shift our programming online. Also, about half of our committee had left for one reason or another, fortunately, all of their own accord, but we had very few staff members, and the few staff members who were on there were leading these initiatives to respond to COVID-19. And so I think it's important to honor the reality of that. And so we're resuming everything. I'm very fortunate to have a very strong co-chair, and we are honoring the fact that we are restarting the IDEA committee. We're saying, yeah, we've been on hiatus for the past 9 months. There's been a lot going on. We needed to take a pause, and that's what we needed to do. Certainly there were missed opportunities because of that. I'm not saying that it's something that it's an excuse. There's certainly missed opportunities, but it is important to honor the reality of that. And I think one way that we also honored the reality of that is when so many organizations were putting out Black Lives Matter statement, our CEO and our board president were really struggling about what to say. And that actually ended up being our Black Lives Matter statement. It was, we need to be better because Black Lives Matter. And it was about how botanic gardens industry-wide, the idea of a botanic garden, the idea of an art museum, as Olivia mentioned, is just doused in white privilege. We have to acknowledge that historically we have not been an inclusive place, and that it's something that we need to be better about. And I think it's really hard for organizations to be vulnerable. I was reading an excerpt about how the idea of perfection is white supremacy, and it's being vulnerable is not perfect. And so by saying we need to be better, it's difficult. I think that the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, or at least onto a national stage, heightens our focus on that. So we can't ignore it or say that we'll get to it. The time is now. So while I was just saying, yes, we have an age issue and we need to talk about that, this is part of the staff are saying we need to talk about age. The world is saying we need to talk about race. So both of those things, we're getting the pressure. So over the next year, those two things are going to be the biggest catalyst. And I think it's been a wake up, both COVID-19 and the murders of George Floyd and other Black Americans have really just shed the spotlight on what the priorities of institutions need to be, and how we need to change to be better for our community.
All right, thank you, both of you. We have so many questions in the Q&A. I don't think we can get to them all. And I just want to encourage everyone, there will be a resource packet. If it's not linked to our session yet, it may be in the next day or two. I was a little late with that, and there's kind of a lag, so I do apologize if that's not there yet, but it includes contact information for myself, Eliza, and Ali. Please feel free just to shoot us an email if you want to chat more about something. We're all happy to continue the discussion. I do want to ask one question in the Q&A just because multiple people have been asking very similar questions. So someone has expressed concern, with regard to bringing in more diverse groups, more minority groups, how do you make it feel like it's not just checking that diversity box? What measures can we take? And a kind of related question is, how do you diversify a board or volunteers, whatever it may be? How do you find those people and bring them in? So Ali or Eliza, whoever wants to kind of take that.
Sure. So when we were forming our idea committee, we were thinking about how to have community voice. And we ultimately elected that it wasn't the place in order to, our staff committee wasn't really the best place to invite community members, because we wanted it to also be a safe space for our staff to collaborate. And that wasn't always something that was fair for either party to be involved in. However, we did know that we needed a community voice. So we did two things. Several of our board committees, we invite community members to be a part of. So we have somebody who isn't a board member on our governance committee, specifically to have a community voice on our governance committee. We also started a community advisory committee, which is spearheaded by our education department. And we brought together diverse voices to really just talk about, what does Tower Hill mean to your community? What does it mean? And then unpacking that. And we had our first meeting last year, and I think most people would not be surprised. They said, it feels like it is a hoity-toity rich place. About half of the members of the committee had been there and said, now that I've gone there, I know that's not the case. And about half the members actually had never been to Tower Hill, but they were interested in the environment and the fact that they were reached out and asked about. Somebody asked the question about how to make it not tokenism. And I have two sort of responses to that. One is, people love to be asked to participate. And I think that was something that we realized as we were putting together the community advisory committee, is they wanted to be a part of it. Diversity, equity, inclusion was important to them. And so we were very upfront about, we're getting diverse professionals together to talk about how Tower Hill can be better. And so they were already thinking about that. We looked at people's titles. So if, at the senior center, they were the Elders Affair coordinator, and they hosted several multicultural groups for the senior center. So this was somebody we already kind of knew was on board with this. I also remember a interview that I was having with a board member, and he was talking about, not very long ago, that it was radical to have a Jewish board member. And he knew in the 60s and 70s, he knew that the only reason why he was getting invited to boards was because he was Jewish. And I said, how did that make you feel? And he said, I knew it, and I was glad to be the first person. So I don't think anybody on this email is going to say, hey, because you're a transgender Black woman, we'd like you on this committee. That, if I received that, I would say that's a little much. But if you're writing and saying, based on your experience, I can read through the lens on that. And also your work in XYZ organization, or your PhD studies, or whatever it might be, we need you there. So it needs to be that you have this identity piece, and you love art, you are passionate about the environment, you are a community leader, something else, that there's sort of two reasons why you're inviting them to the committee. They're going to be more than happy to join. And in terms of thinking about diversity, we actually did create a matrix of what diversity meant for Tower Hill, and who needed to be on that committee, to make sure that we were literally checking all of the boxes. Not to say that that's the only reason, but me, as somebody who's really connected to the queer community, I said, I don't want there to be 1 million queer people on the committee. That's not diverse. That's inherently not diverse. So we really gave ourselves these are the communities that are important in Worcester, and these are the communities that we want to make sure are on the committee. And there are some gaps, but also then there were some people who said, hey, I'm not going to be on this committee, but this awesome other person is going to be on the committee because they can do this better. So I think at the end of the day, it's understanding that people know why you're reaching out, and they're not necessarily going to be offended I'm going to say 99% of the time, as long as you approach it with that idea of compassionate curiosity, and it's somebody whose voice you really want on the committee for more than just their personal experience, but for something that's about their activism or their profession, I think they're going to be open to joining whatever effort you have.
Do I have time to respond, Olivia, or should we move on to another question? Just briefly, okay. So I think that's, I really appreciate that question about how to diversify one's visitorship. And I think as Jamal Jimerson spoke a little bit about, and as we've sort of touched upon today, there are so many components to doing that in a meaningful way. And we've actually experienced some of the ways that we've been unsuccessful, I think, in some of our sort of community partnerships. But I think it's about so many things, which again speaks to why this is such a cyclical conversation across an organization. I think it's about the kind of projects that one is putting together, the interpretation of those projects, who the people are who are behind them, the kind of environment that an institution is creating. All of these things play a role in one's experience and attraction to coming to something. And I think that also can sort of play into how one diversifies a board. Who's coming to your institution? I mean, that's part of what can be, to sort of attract someone and get someone interested in being on your board. Do you have sort of a diverse visitorship coming to your museum? And then I think just the way that a lot of boards are very network oriented. Who are your board members? Who are in their networks? What kind of communities are they a part of? If they don't have diverse communities, then it probably will be hard to sort of expand that network, at least sort of initially. So I think those are sort of two things that can play a really big role in diversifying visitorship and board members.
Thank you, Eliza. So in the last 3 minutes we have here, there was a question that came into the Q&A that I think is kind of an important one to address, coming from Gail Gifford. So she writes, respectfully, why did it take all these years to finally dig deep? What prevented gaining steam earlier? And I did respond in the chat, but I just want to say here, sort of speaking from the Worcester Art Museum's perspective, we did have some DEI measures in the past, kind of off and on over the years. So it's not necessarily that we never started digging deep in the past. The issue is really finding a way to sustain those efforts. So don't let them fall through the cracks. And, the museum has experienced, especially I think during the recession, some rounds of layoffs and budget cuts in the past that I think hampered those, which is why it's so important to focus also on what you can do that doesn't cost a lot of money, as well as pursuing some of those bigger initiatives. We all know that as nonprofits, as museums, we need to be flexible. But I was wondering, Ali and Eliza, if either of you want to address that at all. I think it is kind of an important question to take note of.
I saw that, and I was partway through responding. I think that this is part of like honoring your history and honoring the reality of it. While the Horticultural Society has been around for over 175 years, the garden has only been around for 30. So in those early decades, it was about turning a farm into a botanic garden. And it was those original founders of the Botanic and coordinators and what was on their mind. And I think it's just a reality that diversity, equity, inclusion wasn't on their mind. And we sort of went through a renaissance, if you will, over the past 5 years. And part of that was making everybody feel welcome. But the definition of everybody was not clearly defined. And it increased our membership and our visitation widely, but it didn't necessarily diversify it because we're changing our program so more people are interested. And I think now this is just kind of the second chapter. I think it's also important to, understand that diversity, equity, inclusion is now on the tips of people's tongues. And that's a realistic reason why. And so I think that if you're on this call and you're saying, it's too late, it's not too late. It's the perfect time because you're sitting here. Somebody had asked earlier about, what happens when you don't have leadership buy-in, and you can do all you want to try to sway those leaders, and you may not feel comfortable or have the skills or feel that it's appropriate for you to do so. And I think then the best you can do is, what does diversity, what do you have personal control over? So if you're a front desk associate, it's making sure you're saying hello to everybody, doing some reading about what if somebody comes in and doesn't speak English, how could I interact with them and how could I be better? What kind of accommodations would a visually impaired person mean? Or if you're higher up in the organization and you do have more spheres of influence, what can you realistically do? And I think it's never too late to do anything. This is the perfect time. It's the perfect excuse to say you got back from NEMA, just the same way that my CEO did. I got back from this conference and the time is now.
Thank you, Allie. Speaking of time, I think we are fully out of it. If our NEMA friends here want to confirm that, but I believe the stream has ended, correct? I think you're muted.
Brooke, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so the session ends at 12:15.
Great. So I just want to thank everyone for coming, and please do reach out to us. So.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank
We look
you.
forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you for a great session.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.